So here we are again with John Butler, diving deeper into, I keep showing the book. I love the cover, John. Wonders of Spiritual Unfoldment. I have to ask you, where was this? In the Redwoods in California?
No, my dear, it was in Russia.
Oh, of course.
Russia. Yes, it was. It was a wonderful great oak tree, and I was standing in the hollow oak tree. And actually, I'll tell you why, because there's a famous Russian saint who called Saint, what was his name? He was Saint Tihon, which means Saint, it's Saint Peaceful, Saint Peaceful. And he lived in a hollow oak tree and alone in the forest. Russians rather like that sort of thing, and so do I. That's why when I came across this lovely oak tree, the person I was with at the time took a photograph. I always liked it.
It's beautiful.
Yes.
So, chapter 6.
Yes.
And the title is On Seeing the Self, 1984, 5. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about the title, John, and On Seeing the Self. Can you talk a little bit about the meaning of self with a capital S to you?
The self, indeed. Well, I learned to meditate at a school of meditation in London. And up till that time, the only meaning I'd attributed to self was you must not be selfish. And I'd never heard of a self, of another sort of self. But apparently I was to learn there's what's called the small self, which is often equated with the ego. That means I, me, or mine. And then don't be selfish has meaning. And then there's another self, which is spelled with a big S, which refers to, well, what does it refer to? It's this rather nebulous, whatever it is. I suppose you could call it the soul, or the real, the spiritual part of man, body, mind, and spirit. Well, who knows what spirit is? It's invisible. It's silent. And this really is the mysterious destiny of spiritual work, which may become somewhat less mysterious with long-term acquaintance and going into it deeper and deeper, but it's still something that you cannot define, you cannot bring it down into the realm of words. It's really what a man is, or that part of a man, a woman, of course, which you can take beyond the grave. Now, that may sound a bit blunt, but actually it's a very useful principle to bear in mind. The question, what can I take beyond the grave? What can you take beyond the grave? When you look at someone, or look at yourself in the mirror and consider what's going to die, and then what, if anything, doesn't die? And what is not going to rot away in a grave, and what is going to be saved with a bit of luck? And it's a very good way of focusing your attention on what one might say matters, the important bit. So on seeing the self, perhaps it's rather a sort of rather presumptuous title, but it's certainly getting at least a glimpse of what it is in someone that is imperishable, incorruptible, immortal. the undying reality of someone. I wonder if that's sufficient for now. When you first see it, or at least in this chapter where I'm trying to describe it, it was a life-changing experience for me. I'd never seen it with such an impact, and it really changed my whole focus on life.
On the first page, you write, "I only partially understood that the response I so longed for lay beyond our human means. I looked for fulfillment where it could not be found."
Well, that puts it rather well. I forget, a long time since I wrote those words. Goodness me, I'm often surprised at when people read back what I wrote all those years ago. Yeah, that puts it quite well, doesn't it? Can you just read that again, dear?
"I only partially understood that the response I so longed for lay beyond our human means.
Gosh.
Looked
Yeah.
for fulfillment where it could not be found."
Gosh, yes. Well, what did I long for? What did I long for? The love that never said no. Perfect love. The ideal. Perfection. That's right, perfection. And I looked for fulfillment where it could not be found. Well, she looked for fulfillment towards emotions and the mental, the changing moods of our minds, which is, of course, yes today and no tomorrow, isn't it? It's always changing. It's she loves you, she loves me not. It's extraordinary how you would, fall in love with some beautiful first impression, and then a week later, it's sort of not the same. When we're so experienced, it can be very upsetting. You get a lovely letter, one day, and then the next one is not quite so warm, and you know where you are. I suppose. Yes, I married late, but I married a good woman, and we were just so incredibly naive. We were very fond of each other. We did our best. We were both, we weren't immature at the time, but totally ignorant of what makes a man tick or a woman tick. And I just didn't understand. And looking back now, I feel ashamed and so sorry that I just didn't know. I was so ignorant, really. I didn't understand women's moods and, the ups and downs of what is really quite normal, but I just didn't understand it. And she didn't understand me. And so we had a lot of friction, and we would forgive and forget and try to make friends again, but it would all start again. And it's not always so easy, is it, to live with someone else in a small space? So anyway, there we are. And all the time I was longing for this perfection. And of course, very often you don't see it in your nearest and dearest. That's the trouble. You see it in somebody else. That's what happened to me.
So, John, when you're talking about your first wife and you're talking about love, are you talking about love between men and women? I know that's like one stage of love. We've talked about this in another recording? Or are you talking about, like here you describe, what does it mean to see the self in another person? It sounds almost to me that it is beyond the love that we think about in a relationship or earthly experience. Could you go a little deeper?
Our understanding, it develops slowly, doesn't it? At this time, I was in my mid-30s, I think I was in my, can't remember when I was married. I suppose it was my mid-30s. But up till then, most of my conceptions, my dreams of love had been of a woman. I didn't really think in other terms. Of course, I loved my farm. That the way it was simple. I loved the land, I loved nature. But apart from that, I don't think I really thought very much about love other than with a woman. I don't think I remember being told at school to love God, but how can you love? Well, what is God anyway? It all seemed so sort of airy-fairy, sort of out of this world. And I wasn't as familiar with being out of the world as I am now. I wanted a flesh and blood woman. So when I had this experience of seeing what I've called here, seeing the self, of seeing beyond the woman into this spiritual dimension, I was completely sort of blown out of my mind, really. It's something I hadn't experienced before, and certainly not in such an astoundingly, with such astounding reality. It wasn't just something I read about in a book. It was, wow, it was in my eyes. I saw it. Well, with what? With these eyes, which was invisible. How could I see it? And yet, I saw it. How do you see the invisible? I hope you'll know what I mean. I can't find the words to describe it, because in a way it's beyond words. But the reality was such that I don't know if we still use that phrase, blew my mind. I thought it was rather accurate. It's just about what it did do. It turned my life upside down for years. Although as this chapter goes on, you'll see that the story develops.
I really hope people will read the book. If you're watching this recording, you really need to read the book, because there is so much depth here that we would be recording for hours. And as I read it and reread the chapter, I start relating to it differently each time. But John, on the next page, since you were just talking about God, you write, we all know to some extent that God is within us. And then you write, like the skins of an onion, our human personality imposes layer upon layer of covers over and around our basic primal being. I think we can really relate to that, feeling the layers.
Yeah, so that describes it. Actually, it's a classic way, isn't it, of describing yes, how the sort of kernel of reality, the soul in everyone, is sort of encased in layers, layer upon layer of, first of all, mental conditioning, and finally this sort of physical embodiment, which encloses it like a shell of a nut almost, you know. And of course, that's what you see when you look at people. You see this outer encasement. And then they start talking, and you suddenly find yourself just sort of swapping mental impressions, and perhaps in ordinary experience, it's only when you get the opportunity to look deep into somebody's eyes, preferably when you're both quiet, that you get a glimpse of something more. The eyes are referred to as windows of the soul, aren't they? And it's a good description. Then you may find that there's actually an unspoken communication. You talk of love light in the eyes, don't you? And often it's just what it is when you look deep into people's eyes. Well, you feel a sort of a love. Well, you can also feel a hatred. I remember somebody once glaring at me across a table, with eyes like a snake, really. Well, I'm sorry. But not something not very pleasant at all. But it's lovely when you because you never know what's coming out of your own eyes, do you? But you can see the love light in somebody else's eyes.
The experience with that female fellow meditator, as you say, blew your mind.
Yes.
What changed? So to me, it sounds like it blew a layer of your, as you say, your onion, like it connected to the core. How did that change for you? What changed for you in life moving forward from that point?
Dear gosh. Well, I wouldn't say it was an immediate process at all. It took many years. In fact, I was wandering around. I remember I described it homeless, jobless, loveless, and alone for some 5 years or so after that. What was the effect of it? Well, as it began to sink in, I couldn't really go back to living in the world without it. See, I was a farmer. I was living in a physical world, very physical world. I worked with my muscles. I was married to a good woman, but it wasn't a really an emotional marriage. It was a sort of practical marriage, really, a good working partnership, really. I just couldn't go back to that sort of life. I felt I'd been sort of taken out of it, and I just felt unable to any longer function as I had been. I recently bought a little motor caravan, one of the early ones, just a little one. But it sort of, I could really hardly bear to be at home. It really hurts me to say this because I loved her deeply, but I just couldn't bear that. Being in that environment, I just got explosive. It just was too small for me. I'd sort of been blown into a bigger dimension. I'd seen beyond all that. And my heart just, I knew that this was what it was all about. And I just couldn't go back into something that was smaller. And so I spent more and more time in my caravan. I just go away and park somewhere and just fight within myself with all these conflicting things, my duty, what was the right thing to do. And it was in a total turmoil, really, in both mind and heart. And I don't know, I can't remember how long this went on for, quite some months. And gradually the heart went out of the farm. And I felt I'd worked that chapter of my life out, really, and I was being pulled into this new destiny that I couldn't really control. It was bigger than me. I couldn't deny it. I'd seen into a new reality, and I couldn't go back into the old one. It was like I'd been born, and I couldn't go back into the womb again. I just couldn't stop being born. Born into a new reality. And so I think by the time a year had passed, it was horrid because my poor wife was sort of bewildered by it all. She understood a little bit, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't know myself what was happening. I was just getting explosive. And so, honestly, as much to protect her, I was afraid, I was like a bear in a cage, I was really quite afraid, I'd get violent. And well, thank God I never did. Well, at least when I did, at least I didn't hurt her. But I was afraid I might. And so I felt that the only option really was just to create space and spend more time in the caravan, which I did. And so gradually I just moved into these years of just being completely lost, just drifting around, feeling I couldn't go back home, couldn't go back to where I had my previous security and home. I was just drifting around in a completely lost state, with like occasional sort of glimpses of this spiritual reality that sort of kept the fire alive, really. But the day-to-day reality was awful depression, awful, dreadful, God, completely without orientation, didn't know where to go, just drifting around, hopeless, not knowing anything. God, I know something about depression, my dears.
What do you think kept you going? Just as you're sharing here now, it sounds like deep down inside, something was pulling you, call it God, call it whatever.
Well, of course, I hoped, and for at least the first year or two, although I know this vision never developed into the affair. I'd have done anything. I do understand people that just throw their marriage, their families aside and go off with another woman. I would have done that. All the reason, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, all these sort of good things that I've been brought up with, is extraordinary. When you burst into a new reality, this is the greater compulsion. I'd have done all that, but she wouldn't have it. She said no. So it never developed into anything. But of course, I'd have given half my life for that. But it didn't happen, so I had to live with that awful disappointment of the woman I loved with a love that was more than love. Yes, more than anything I'd previously conceived of as love. Didn't want me in the same way. You see, I had the vision. She didn't have the same vision of me. It wasn't the same. When anybody that knows, as most people have had some taste of unrequited love, it's not much fun, is it? You've got to go and lick your wounds on your own. So I did that. What kept me going? God knows, my dear. Well, I had hope of this woman for some time. I suppose that kept me going. And as that hope gradually faded, what kept me going? God knows. I don't know, dear. I practically didn't. I didn't kill myself, but I wasn't far off it. God knows. I just drifted around. I picked fruit to earn some money. And we took the caravan to Spain for a winter. Because I know what kept going. I can answer that seriously now. I've always loved to meditate. And at this time, I'd been meditating 20 years or more. And I started using, I've been taught a traditional Sanskrit mantra, which I'd used up to this point, and I started using her name. Yes, I meditated on her name, and I found that wonderful because in a way, it seemed to me that she would come to me in spirit. That's what kept me going. Yes, that's what happened. On many occasions, it seemed she came to me in spirit. Extraordinary. Yes, sleeping in the caravan. One winter, I had a warm duvet. I could sit cross-legged at that time. I'd sit cross-legged on my bed and wrapped up in my duvet. I'd spend half the night in meditation. Hour after hour, I'd sit there calling on her name, and she came to me. Also, it seemed to me she came. And of course, there you sort of, there you're in the realm of love that doesn't say no. The realm of, I wouldn't say perfect love, but in comparison to the beginnings and end of ordinary physical love, in spirit it doesn't have an end, you see. This is the difference. This world, in time and space, everybody that's made love, it reaches a climax and it's over, isn't it? You turn around and go to sleep. It's sort of, it's a variable thing, but when this happens in spirit, there's a sort of forever quality about it. There's a sort of, in a way, a security that is not so usual in ordinary physical life. In a funny way, it always becomes preferable to a physical relationship. Yes, when I went to Spain, I spent hours just sitting by the beach there. There was a grove of date palms, and I just go out in the morning. I had a little bit of foam rubber, I remember there. A little cushion, I'd sit under these date trees, isolated. It wasn't a pop tourist resort, it was just a caravan park, really. And I'd spend most of the day there just sitting, meditating. And there I felt she came to me. It kept me going. Of course, it was out of this world. And then I'd come back into the world with people talking about dinners and have a drink, John, or how have you been today? And I just couldn't get back into that world. I didn't belong there any longer. So I felt ever more isolated, this terrible loneliness that's dogged me for so much of my life. It was absolutely dreadful. I was so alone. There's nobody I could talk to, nobody who understood. At times I really felt I was going out of my mind. And it's funny, between awful depression and this sort of spiritual comfort. Strange times. Wonderful, dreadful. I've always been able to write. That's when I wrote. Well, there's these, you'll read some extracts in this book, and there's another book that actually, it's the next book I'm going to publish called Mystic Love Letters to this woman, Mystic Love Letters to Christine. That was her name. When I poured my heart out. Yes, every evening I'd come back and just write to her. Poured out my heart. Funny enough, a lot of poetry flowed out of me at this time. Always the best poetry is written from unhappy love, isn't it? Unrequited love. That's when the heart is crying out and often at its most expressive. Yeah. So the days passed, time dragged on. Spring came.
Going out of my mind. That's probably a really good thing.
Well, yes, it is. If you're interested in spiritual work, yes, it can be certainly a blessing in disguise. So don't get in a panic if you feel you're going out of your mind. There are realms of being far beyond what we call the mind. Indeed, that's what saving the soul is all about. And I spent the rest of my life sort of exploring in a way beyond the mind. That's what spiritual work is.
And you write, now 20 years on, I read those last lines, and especially the words, I want, with a great sense of danger, the mantra of personal me.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Yes, it all seems so obvious to me now, but of course at the time it wasn't. Normally, most of our speech and our thinking is based on me, isn't it? I. What do I think of the world situation? What do I want? What am I going to have for dinner? Who do I love? It's all based on me, which is the ego. And spiritually speaking, where the more you come to recognize this ego, you see that it's this which separates us. You see, I'm me and you're you. We're two different people, each with two different mental conditioning, and you're in one place and I'm in another. But as we come to spirit, we discover this invisible, silent reality. It's like an invisible, silent background or ocean in which we, like two little fishes, swim around, touching noses and saying hello, goodbye, but not always aware that we're swimming around in this great ocean which contains us both. In fact, there's a rather sweet little story about two fishes, an old wise fish and a little baby fish. And the little one went to the old wise fish and said, where is this thing they call the ocean? Well, this is our human situation, isn't it? Because I'm in this rather peculiar position of talking on YouTube, people come to me and say, how do I find God? Or something like that. It's rather like that little fish, isn't it? How do I find love? That's a bit more difficult because it's very hard to say this love when we're longing for a physical body to hold is actually, well, that is real in its reality, but there's a greater love reality, which is really this ocean. But because we don't get that, it takes a long spiritual work to for that to come into focus as a reality. But it can be found. That's why they say God is love. When I first heard that, it was just meaningless to me. Yes, now I try to avoid in my speech the words I want. In fact, whenever I hear my voice saying I or me or mine, there's sort of like a red warning light comes on in my brain and shut up because I'm going in the wrong direction. I'm talking about my separate me, my separate self with a small s, rather than this universal self or the spirit. Which isn't separate, which is one, undivided, which we spell with a big S, the big self. But of course, that takes many, many years of practice to lessen one's dependence on the separate I want you, I love you, and grow into this larger self, where there's no I and you, it's all one. And it's not really a matter of I love you, but of being in love, which means this ocean of love. we're in it, whether we recognize it or not. Of course, most people don't recognize it, but occasionally one does.
As I'm listening to you, John, it just brings home what you so often say. It's really about the experience of it all versus the knowing or the reading or the thinking about it.
Yes.
Coming back to the work. Exactly,
dear. Yes, anyone can read about it and talk about it, but it's the actual reality in experience that that's what makes it real, doesn't it? That's why it's called realization. That's right, and that's why self-realization is what makes it real. And also interesting is the word, see, real knowledge is not something we read about or can talk about. Real knowledge is revealed. That's why the last chapter of the Bible is Revelation. It is revealed to us, just like when you look up at a cloudy sky and suddenly the clouds pass and the blue sky is revealed. Otherwise, you might believe the sun didn't exist. And in winter, days and weeks pass and you never see the sun and you begin to doubt its existence. And then, lo and behold, the clouds pass and wow, you're reminded that it's there. Or when you go up in an aeroplane, you can go in midwinter, cloudy, dismal weather. You get up in an aeroplane, go through the clouds and, good heavens, what's this? You've completely forgotten about this blue sky, haven't you? It's just up there all the time.
Maybe we can wrap this chapter up with this last sentence you wrote where you were reflecting. You write, it was a classic case of pride coming before a fall, but at the time, even I practically realized it. I had no will to escape. And I think we've all, I know for myself, getting stuck in pride or pride is that happens. It's a common thing. So as you write, it was a classic case of pride coming before a fall.
What did I refer to then as pride?
You're referring to the now 20 years on, I read those last lines, especially the words I want.
Oh, I see, yes.
Sense of danger, and you connect that I wanting to pride.
Yes. Well, I wanted this woman. I couldn't deny it. With every fiber of my being, I longed for her body, mind, and spirit. Total, yes, I'd have died for her. I just was. It was absolutely imperative in me. I couldn't deny it. Pride coming before a fall. Well, I didn't half have a fall. Indeed, I did. I was right at the bottom in the pit. But I couldn't deny it. I couldn't pretend I wasn't. See, I'd already been meditating quite some 20 years by then. I was quite a senior member of the school. I was teaching other people to meditate. I was going around the country lecturing on meditation. These were the early days of meditation. There weren't many people doing it. So, yes, I had students coming to me and I'd advise and guide their meditation. It was quite a figure, really, at that time. I'd become known as an organic farmer. I had people coming to see me then in the early days of the organic movement and see what I was up to. I was successful selling my vegetables. And yeah, I was beginning to make a name for myself, and here I was just reduced to a nothing and a nobody, homeless, jobless, loveless, and alone. Yet I had no will to resist it. I was driven by something bigger than me. Something that was more than woman. But when you see into the depth of another soul, it's hard really to say where woman ends and spirit begins, really. In fact, this dividing line between all these dividing lines, they get a bit sort of indefinite, really. You know, there's an old saying, when you're young, you see the world in terms of black and white. As you get older, you just see different shades of grey. And the difference between love of woman and love of God is very hard to say. Why is love of God pure and love of woman impure? Why is one presented as the highest sort of aim of human life, and the other so wrapped up in, you know, thou shalt not and this and that? I couldn't tell you, my dears. I was going up and down like a yo-yo at this time, and was as lost as could be. But I certainly have a great big fall. Oh yes, I think what did fall at this time was my idea of myself, that I was sort of spiritually mature enough to be a guide to others. Yes, that's what collapsed all around me. I was in charge of a number of students, and I just felt I could no longer do it. I felt I wasn't worthy, or I wasn't qualified. I tried for a little while, and I just felt it just no longer real for me. So I had to leave all that, which of course caused quite a rumpus. But I couldn't stop myself. Same way I left my dear good wife and my farm, just drifted off into the never land. I just followed. I just followed my heart. I took the high road to love. There was no person, there was no place, there was nothing to hang on to. Love for what was love. It was just something. It was a spiritual. In these terms of this world, it was nothing. In terms of spirit, it was everything. And I've been a slave of love really all my life. That's what really brought me to where I am now. It's just this pursuit of love, which of course starts with woman. I wouldn't say it doesn't still include woman. I've never really been one to sort of turn away from women. I think it's the great thing is to find the sacred in the woman, to sanctify life. You see, it's when you see the sanctity not only of woman but of everything, the plants, the animals, the creatures. My work as a farmer. See, that's when life is lifted to a nobler level. I suppose this is it. It's really ennobling the fallen creature, lifting it up, the raising of consciousness. Yes. Yes, I don't really believe in rejecting anything, even the ego. You see, somehow it's part of the divine. What do you call it? The divine. Everything really is also intermeshed, and one thing just. I tell you how I see it really like the way that the water vapor condenses gradually into clouds, and then the clouds drop rain, and the rain falls into puddles, and the puddles freeze. So you get ice and snow, but it's basically all water, isn't it? It's all In the same way, this life's all spirit. What we call bodies is really like frozen spirit. That's why it's solid, you see, and breaks. That's what the body is. The body is just crystallized or frozen spirit. So when the heart melts, the hard edges soften, and then extraordinary the effect. Funny enough, there have been some visitors seeing me today, 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women and another woman. And when they said goodbye, they were all crying. When one of the men in particular came, he was sort of quite abrasive in a way. I this and I that. And there was another young man, he knew everything. He was just 25 and he was, I know this, I know that. He'd been to various retreats and read a few books. Of course, he knew everything. He wasn't too keen on being told he didn't know anything. And all this was just book knowledge. But he wrote me the sweetest letter this morning, thanking me, realizing that he didn't know anything. In fact, so I was some service to him. But anyway, all these people, they all ended up, bless myself, I was crying too this morning as we said goodbye. I mean, what happens in this is sort of extraordinary, isn't it? I don't know. Something happens and people's hearts melt and we just cry. I love that. I love tears. And I think there is always a sign that we're going in the right direction when the heart melts. And one just sort of shows one's vulnerability and literally, the hard I can, I can't, right and wrong, it just melts and you come to a deeper understanding of things. Love, really, deeper love.